So, not too long ago, I published a video on how events in Snyder's Dawn of the Dead would have likely transpired had the Milwaukee survivors stayed at the Crossroads Mall. But after I published that particular what if, I realized that not many people have discussed how the story could have developed if the island the survivors fled to had been safe. Now, in order to actually cover this thought experiment properly, I'm going to have to cover two distinct scenarios. The first being a safe island which happens to be inhabited by other survivors, and the second being a vacant island, devoid of any living people or undead freaks. But before we begin, we gotta take a quick detour. You see, some people actually think it's possible that the Milwaukee survivors managed to avoid being eaten alive after the film's end credits, despite the fact that their boat's engine was fried and that they were clearly overrun by the undead, with their backs to the ocean. It should be hella obvious, but apparently it isn't. So here's a screenshot of James Gunn confirming the fate of our survivors in a typically humorous manner. And for those of you who don't know, James Gunn wrote the screenplay for Dawn of the Dead, whereas Zack Snyder directed the film. But yeah, no one fucking survived. So with that being said, let's go ahead and begin with the second scenario, as that one is, in my opinion, the least interesting and also the quickest to cover. Anna, Kenneth, Terry, Nicole, and the best doggo Chips arrive at the mysterious island off the coast of Milwaukee. Which, by the way, this island is clearly fictional. There ain't no islands near Milwaukee. That said, the four survivors, accompanied by their cute pup, depart from their vessel and wade through the woods only to find that this sizable island is miraculously devoid of any people or zombies. Considering that other islands on Lake Michigan, like Beaver Island for example, allow for hunting and camping, it's highly likely that this fictional island will have hunting cabins, especially since it already had a dock for watercraft. As such, the Milwaukee group eventually finds a cabin to shelter in, and fortunately for them, it's still summertime. We know this to be the case because of Andy's lost tapes, which is part of the film's bonus DVD content. Now, since it's the summertime, our group won't have much trouble finding wild game. These islands are known to have ducks, geese, wild turkeys, and sometimes deer. But an island of this size might also be home to black bears. The group would also likely find some fishing gear as well in the cabin or somewhere along the docks. Lake Michigan itself will also provide our survivors with plenty of water, so long as our characters boil said water. As such, survival will not be too difficult for the Milwaukee group. That is until they slowly run out of ammunition for hunting, at which point they'll have to painstakingly learn, through trial and error, how to craft snares and other traps. Eventually, they'd learn how to craft wooden spears, and eventually they'd learn how to hunt with them as well. And as time passes, the leaves will start to turn red, yellow, brown, and orange. And eventually, autumn will pass and winter will arrive. Suffice it to say, this group of survivors aren't equipped to survive the winter. Even if they manage to learn how to craft clothing from bear and deer skin, they simply won't have the skills necessary to survive when wild game is scarce, fishing is scarce, harvesting crops is impossible, and temperatures drop to near or below freezing. And yes, blizzards do hit the islands of Lake Michigan. Long story short, the Milwaukee group drifts off into the long dark on the island, as casualties of the brutal North American winter. Okay, with that scenario being all wrapped up, now we can get to the more interesting variant of this what if. Imagine if our group of ill-prepared survivors arrived at this fictional island only to find that it was inhabited by several dozen survivors from Milwaukee. This, to me, is far more likely to be the case than the first scenario, precisely because other people would have likely had the same idea to flee to said island during the initial onset of the zombie outbreak. After all, how do you think those zombies got on the island in the first place in the canon timeline? Be that as it may, I can see the larger group of island-dwelling refugees checking our protagonist for bite marks. Once it's determined that Kenneth, Anna, Nicole, Terry, and Chips are infection-free, it's likely they'd be allowed to join the small camp of Milwaukee escapees. And odds are that by now this group of strangers would have some sort of community garden. They likely would have their own boats docked elsewhere on the island, and odds are they'd likely have at least one experienced hunter and fisherman. Everyone would likely be working together just to survive. Although I'm sure the camp would be divided among those who believe rescue is eventually coming, and those who want to prioritize preparing for the winter. Despite this minor division, people would slowly side with the realists eventually. And as days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months, the new island settlement will seemingly flourish. Terry and Nicole will also be expecting a child at some point in the future. But when autumn arrives, everyone realizes that things will soon get tumultuous. In order to ensure their survival, the camp agrees to send 3 able-bodied men back to the mainland in order to scavenge for medical supplies, antibiotics, medicine, winter gear, non-perishables, and additional tools and miscellaneous supplies that may come in handy. Kenneth would be among the volunteers to join this expeditionary force. Now, instead of heading back to Milwaukee, everyone agrees to head for Port Washington, as it is a much smaller town than Milwaukee. This scavenging party would likely recon the Port of Washington Marina before coming on shore. And to everyone's dismay, the undead are still wandering by the docks. And there's definitely a shit ton of them too. Upon this unsettling discovery, the scavenging party debates whether to proceed with the mission or to head back. Kenneth is adamant about securing the loot that the island needs, but his crewmates aren't too keen on signing up for a suicide mission. Eventually, everyone elects to sail further upshore, to a more residential coastline. Upon arrival at this new coastline, it seems peaceful and the undead are nowhere to be seen. The boat anchors close to shore and Kenneth embarks with one of his crewmates, straight to the nearest upper-middle-class home. One man stays behind to ensure the safety of the boat. And after a few hours of gathering supplies from the affluent coastal homes, Kenneth and his battle buddy Bob run into a slight problem. A small horde of the undead have made their way to this abandoned neighborhood after following the boat. The 2 men notice the biters and make a run for the boat, only to realize the undead can still sprint like fresh Olympic athletes. Kenneth, being encumbered by the weight of his loot, throws his large duffel bag to Bob and tells him to go on without him. Bob, being a bitch, doesn't hesitate to abandon Kenneth. And just like that, Kenneth is eaten alive and Bob returns to the boat with some delicious jams and goodies. Eventually, the 2 surviving men return to camp with the supplies. And you know what? They managed to get a little bit of everything during their expedition, which is great news for our survivors. But the death of Kenneth and the confirmation of the undead's grip over the mainland causes everyone to fear ever launching another scavenging operation. They simply do not have the manpower or firepower to risk going back to the shores of Wisconsin for supplies. With that being said, winter eventually arrives and tests the camp's ability to survive. And eventually Chips is eaten when the limited amount of non-perishable foods are depleted. Survivors who freeze or die are also eaten as a result, as the camp resorts to cannibalism in order to sustain their dietary needs. Portions of Lake Michigan also freeze, stranding the survivors until the end of winter. Despite all of the pain and misery, most members of the camp survive, and their newly garnered winter survival experience will come in clutch for the next winter. And it is right here where I'm gonna have to end the story, because the group could either eventually die out over the years, or maybe they'll be rescued by the government or other survivors. Who fucking knows? The point is, our initial cast of survivors needs other people with various skill sets in order to survive on this sort of island. And even then, long-term survival is not guaranteed. There still would be problems like the brutal Wisconsin winter, inbreeding, dwindling resources, internal conflict, potential diseases, and other issues that would make long-term survival on the island extremely difficult. Like, if this was a tropical island like the one on Lost, it'd be a completely different story. But the winter is what really makes this such a difficult state of affairs for the Milwaukee survivors. Anyways, if you like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, click the bell as well if you'd like to be notified whenever I publish a new video. And remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined down in the comments section. I'm Captain Gold, and I hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.